About 90% of states now have metering requirements requiring at least gradual incorporation of meters. However, most of those states do not impose specific pricing requirements. Some do encourage conservation pricing, but in a non-binding manner. Now, ideally, state law would require not only volumetric billing, but also a rate structure explicitly designed to encourage water conservation, as Minnesota and New Jersey law do. New Jersey requires all public community water systems to establish water rate structures with water conservation incentives, unless the system is small or doesn't use much water. Now, Minnesota requires all public water suppliers serving more than 1,000 people to include either a conservation rate structure or a uniform rate structure with a conservation program.
Now, California has a law that requires gradual adoption of volumetric pricing. As of 1992, California has required water meters for all new construction. And in 2004, California adopted legislation requiring all urban water suppliers to install water meters on all M&I connections by 2025, on all service connections constructed before 1992. Once meters are installed, suppliers were required to adopt volumetric pricing by January 1st, 2010. The supplier can recover the cost of purchasing and installing meters from customers. And if a water supplier is newly organized after 2005, that supplier has 10 years to install meters and 5 years after that to initiate volumetric pricing.
Well, volumetric pricing sounds like a nice idea, but the process for developing volumetric rates can be quite tricky. So in addition to conservation effectiveness, a water provider has to think about a number of factors in adopting a rate. Now, these include the ease and cost of implementing the rate and whether the rate protects the availability of water for basic needs. The water provider also has to think about the stability of revenues coming into the provider to ensure that bills and other financial obligations can be paid.
Well, that does sound tricky. To illustrate, let's look at these factors applied to a couple of different kinds of volumetric rates. So the first category we identified was high uniform rates, under which one high rate for water is imposed regardless of consumption. Basically, a provider would raise water rates uniformly to encourage people to use less. Now, this approach is obviously easy to administer, and there's no complicated formula required, at least not after the rate is set. But setting the rate itself can be tricky in states like California that require water rates to be revenue neutral. This sets a cap on how high the rates can be. We'll talk more about California requirements in a bit. But even outside of such states, other challenges exist. For example, rates may not be high enough to encourage conservation. Also, a high rate for everyone may not provide enough affordable water for basic needs. A high rate also fails to protect low-income consumers. At some point, some basic quantity of water is a necessity, not a luxury. Where is that line? And how does the provider ensure enough water for low-income families? These are really important questions.
Our second category of conservation pricing was inclining block rates. Now, under these rate structures, as more water is consumed, the more expensive it gets. Inclining block rates send a strong price signal to water users that their consumption is directly linked to an increase in rates. This provides a conservation incentive. However, a big problem with conservation rates is that they can result in revenue volatility and uncertainty. Here's why. If conservation rates work and people conserve water, well, the water provider has less money coming in. Yet the provider still has to pay operation and maintenance costs for its storage, conveyance, and treatment facilities. It still has to pay labor costs, and it has to pay off the bonds that it's issued to finance its facilities. These costs are all relatively fixed. Now, further complicating all this is that people's behavior is unpredictable. The economy can affect conservation, as can the weather. So if it rains less, people may use more water for landscaping, regardless of rates.
And another issue is created when providers adopt the same rates across a broad category of use. For example, a single rate for residential use. This can create equity issues. A large single-family home needs more basic water than small single-family homes.